The whole galaxy was watching Earth that day. Every news channel, every broadcast station, every information network across 1,000 worlds had their attention fixed on a single building in New Geneva. The United Terran Embassy stood tall against the gray morning sky. Its walls made of crystal and steel that caught the light and threw it back in rainbow patterns. Samuel Torres pushed his mop across the marble floor in the far corner of the grand hall. He was a quiet man of 53 years, with gray hair and tired eyes and hands that had grown rough from decades of honest work. He had been a janitor at the embassy for 11 years now, and he liked his job. It was simple. It was peaceful. Nobody bothered him, and he bothered nobody. Today was different, though. Today, the hall was filled with people he had never seen before. Military officers in crisp uniforms stood at attention along the walls. Diplomats from species Samuel could not even name whispered to each other in languages that sounded like music and thunder and breaking glass. President Diane Holbrook herself stood at the center of it all, her silver hair pulled back tight, her face calm and serious. They were all waiting for the Draconians. Samuel had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The Draconian hegemony ruled over 3,000 star systems. Their emperor, Zirvith, was said to be ancient and powerful beyond human understanding. And today, for the first time in history, he was bringing his only daughter to Earth. It was supposed to be a sign of respect, a gesture of peace, proof that humanity had finally earned its place among the older races of the galaxy. Samuel did not care much about politics. He cared about keeping the floors clean. So he kept mopping, staying out of everyone's way, trying to make himself invisible in the corner near the maintenance door. The sound came first. A low rumble that Samuel felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. Through the tall windows, he saw the Draconian shuttle descending from the clouds. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, all sharp angles and gleaming scales, like a living creature made of metal and light. The crowd in the hall fell silent. Even the diplomats stopped their whispering. Samuel leaned on his mop and watched as the great doors at the front of the hall slid open. Emperor Zirvith entered first. Samuel had seen pictures of Draconians before, but nothing had prepared him for the real thing. The emperor stood 12 feet tall, his body covered in scales that shimmered like liquid gold. His eyes burned with an inner fire, 2 points of orange light that seemed to look everywhere at once. When he walked, the floor trembled slightly under his weight. He moved with the slow confidence of a creature that had never known fear. Behind him came his daughter. Princess Calthera was smaller than her father, only about 7 feet tall. She was young for her kind, her scales a brilliant blue that shifted to purple and green as she moved. Her eyes were golden, bright and curious, scanning the crowd with obvious interest. She wore robes of deep crimson that flowed behind her like water. President Holbrook stepped forward, beginning her rehearsed greeting. The translators hummed to life, converting her words into the deep, rumbling language of the Draconians. But something was wrong. The princess had stopped moving. She stood frozen in the middle of the hall, her head tilted to one side, her nostrils flaring wide. She made a sound that Samuel had never heard before, something between a chirp and a gasp. High and sharp and filled with emotion that no translator could interpret. And then she ran, not toward the president, not toward the gathered diplomats, not toward anyone important at all. She ran straight past them, her clawed feet clicking against the marble floor, her robes streaming behind her, heading directly toward the far corner of the hall, heading directly toward Samuel Torres. He did not have time to move. He did not have time to think. One moment he was standing there with his mop in his hands, and the next moment a 7-foot dragon princess had thrown her arms around him and was holding him so tight he could barely breathe. She was crying. Great, heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Her tears were hot against his skin, and they smelled like copper and smoke. "Savior," she said, her voice breaking. The word came out in broken Terran standard, heavily accented but clear enough to understand. "My savior. I found you. I finally found you." Samuel stood there, frozen, his mind completely blank. He had no idea what was happening. He had no idea what he was supposed to do. He just stood there while the most powerful princess in the galaxy held on to him, like he was the only solid thing in the universe. The hall had erupted into chaos around them. Security officers from both species were moving forward, their hands on their weapons, their faces tight with confusion and fear. Nobody knew if this was an attack or a breakdown or something else entirely. "Emperor," Xyrith's voice cut through the noise like a blade. One word, spoken in his own language, deep and commanding. Everyone stopped moving. The Emperor walked slowly toward his daughter and the human janitor she was clutching. His burning eyes studied Samuel with an intensity that made the old man want to shrink away and disappear. "Hail, Thera," the Emperor said, his voice gentler now. "Explain." The princess pulled back just enough to look at her father, but she did not let go of Samuel. Her golden eyes were wet with tears, but there was something fierce in them now, something that would not be denied. "This is him," she said. "This is the human who saved my life." The Emperor's eyes widened. Just slightly, just for a moment, but Samuel saw it. Surprise, and something else that might have been recognition. "You are certain?" the Emperor asked. "I would know his scent anywhere," the princess replied. "I have been searching for 22 years. I never forgot. I never stopped looking. And now I have found him." She turned back to Samuel, her clawed hands still gripping his shoulders. Up close, he could see himself reflected in her golden eyes. He looked old and small and confused. "You saved me," she whispered. "You saved me, and then you disappeared, and no one would tell me where you went. I looked everywhere. I searched every record, every database, every archive in the hegemony. And you were here the whole time, cleaning floors." Samuel opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. His mind was reaching back through the years, digging through memories he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten they existed. A damaged ship, a dying crew, a scared little girl with scales of blue. "Oh," he said softly. "Oh, I remember now." The princess smiled through her tears. "I knew you would." The story came out slowly, piece by piece, like fragments of a broken mirror being put back together. 22 years ago, Samuel Torres had been a different man. He had been younger, stronger, working as a cargo handler on a mining freighter called the Dusty Horizon. It was not a glamorous job, but it paid well enough, and Samuel had liked the quiet of deep space. The Dusty Horizon had been hauling ore through the outer colonies when the distress call came through. A ship was under attack. "Raiders," the message said. "Multiple hostiles. Requesting immediate assistance." Captain Betty Hughes had not hesitated. She had turned the freighter around and pushed the engines to their limit. Some of the crew had argued against it. They were a mining ship, not a warship. They had no weapons worth mentioning, no armor, no training for combat. But Captain Hughes had been a stubborn woman with a strong sense of right and wrong. "Someone's in trouble," she had said. "We help. That's what humans do." They had arrived to find chaos. 3 raider vessels were circling a damaged ship, picking it apart like wolves tearing at wounded prey. The ship was unlike anything Samuel had ever seen, all curves and scales and strange organic shapes. Draconian, he would later learn, though at the time, humans had barely made first contact with that species. What happened next was still a blur in Samuel's memory. The Dusty Horizon had no real weapons, but Captain Hughes had been creative. She had used the ship itself as a battering ram, crashing into the first raider at full speed. The impact had killed her instantly, along with half the crew. But it had given the others time to fight back. Samuel remembered firing a plasma cutter through a hole in the hull, aiming at the second raider's engines. He remembered explosions and screaming, and the terrible sound of metal tearing apart. He remembered watching his crewmates die, one by one, as the battle raged on. When it was finally over, Samuel was the only human left alive. The dusty horizon was crippled, barely holding together, its life support failing. And somewhere in the wreckage of the Draconian ship, he could hear someone crying. He had found her hiding in a storage compartment. A little Draconian girl, no more than 4 years old, her blue scales dull with fear and exhaustion. She had been surrounded by the bodies of her guards, all of them dead. She had been alone and terrified, and so very small that Samuel had not known what to do. He had not known anything about Draconians. He had not known that this little girl was the daughter of an emperor, the heir to 3,000 worlds. All he had known was that she was a child who needed help, so he had helped. The next 6 days had been the hardest of Samuel's life. The dusty horizon systems were failing one by one. The heating went first, and the temperature dropped until Samuel could see his own breath. He had wrapped the little girl in every blanket he could find, and held her close to share his own body heat. Then the food ran out. Samuel had given her his own rations, eating only enough to keep himself functional. When she would not eat the strange human food, he had coaxed her gently, making up games and stories to distract her from the taste. The oxygen had been the worst problem. The ship's air recyclers were damaged, producing less and less breathable air with each passing hour. Samuel had found a single working oxygen mask and had given it to the little girl. He had breathed the thin, stale air himself, feeling his head grow light, his thoughts grow fuzzy. He had talked to her constantly, partly to keep her calm, partly to keep himself awake. He had told her about Earth, about the places he had grown up. He had described the ocean to her, the way the waves kept moving even when everything else was still. He had told her about mountains and forests and fields of golden wheat swaying in the wind. He had sung her songs his mother had taught him when he was a boy. On the 4th day, the little girl had stopped crying. She had curled up against Samuel's chest, her small claws clutching his shirt, and she had listened to his stories with wide golden eyes. On the 5th day, she had started asking questions. What is rain? What is snow? What does the sun feel like on your skin? Samuel had answered every question as best he could. He had painted pictures with words, describing a world she had never seen, a world she might never see. And somewhere in those long, cold hours, something had changed between them. They had stopped being strangers. They had become something else, something he could not name. On the 6th day, the Draconian rescue fleet had arrived. Samuel remembered very little after that. He had been barely conscious, his body failing from hypoxia and starvation. He remembered being lifted onto a stretcher, remembered seeing the little girl being carried away by her own kind. He had tried to call out to her, tried to say goodbye, but no words had come out. And then there had been nothing but darkness. When Samuel had woken up, he was in a human hospital on a colony world 3 systems away. A government official had visited him, a woman with cold eyes and a colder smile. She had explained that the incident was classified. He was to never speak of it to anyone for any reason. In exchange, he would receive a small pension and a medical discharge. They had not even told him the little girl's name. Samuel had spent the next 22 years trying to forget. He had drifted from job to job, colony to colony, never settling anywhere for long. Eventually, he had ended up on Earth, working as a janitor at the embassy. It was quiet work, simple work. It let him fade into the background and disappear. He had almost succeeded in forgetting, but the princess had never forgotten him. Now, As Samuel stood in that grand hall, surrounded by diplomats and soldiers and the most powerful beings in the galaxy, he finally understood. The little girl he had saved, the child he had held through those dark and desperate days, had grown up to become the heir to an empire, and she had spent more than 2 decades searching for him. "I told myself I would find you," Princess Calthera said softly, her claws still resting on his shoulders. "I told myself I would find my savior and thank him properly. Everyone said it was impossible. Everyone said too much time had passed, that the records were gone, that you were probably dead." She smiled, and for just a moment, Samuel could see the little girl she had been. "I never believed them. I knew you were alive somewhere. I knew I would find you someday. And now I have." Samuel did not know what to say. He was just a janitor. He had just been doing what anyone would do. There had been a scared child who needed help, so he had helped her. It was as simple as that. But looking into the princess's golden eyes, he began to realize that maybe it was not simple at all. The days that followed were unlike anything Samuel had ever experienced. His quiet life as a janitor was gone, swept away in a single moment when a dragon princess had recognized his scent and pulled him into an embrace that changed everything. The news spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Every network, every channel, every information stream was filled with the same story. The tale of the human janitor who had saved an emperor's daughter. The cargo handler who had given up his food, his oxygen, his very life to keep a stranger's child alive. Samuel hated every moment of it. He was not a hero. He had never wanted to be a hero. He had just been a man doing what needed to be done. But no one seemed to understand that. Reporters followed him everywhere, shouting questions in a dozen languages. Officials from both human and draconian governments requested meetings with him. Strangers stopped him on the street to shake his hand and thank him for things he did not feel he deserved thanks for. Through it all, Princess Calthera stayed close to him. She visited him every day, arriving at his small apartment with gifts he did not know how to refuse. Fine clothes made from fabrics that shimmered like starlight. Jewels that were probably worth more than everything Samuel had earned in his entire life. Technology so advanced, it seemed like magic. Samuel accepted none of it. He did not know what to do with such things. He just wanted his mop back, but he could not refuse the princess herself. When she asked to sit with him, he let her. When she asked him to repeat the stories he had told her as a child, he tried his best to remember them. And slowly, reluctantly, he began to know her as the person she had become, not just the frightened child she had been. Calthera was smart and fierce and deeply curious about everything. She asked Samuel endless questions about Earth and humanity and the strange things humans did that made no sense to other species. Why did humans keep pets? Why did they listen to music? Why did they tell stories about things that never happened? Samuel answered as best he could, though he often felt like he was explaining colors to someone who had never seen light. Draconian culture was so different from human culture that even simple concepts were hard to translate. One evening, about a week after their reunion, Emperor Zirvath requested a private audience with Samuel. The request was not optional. When an emperor asked to see you, you go. Samuel was brought to a small chamber in the Draconian embassy, a room that had been designed for quiet conversation. Emperor Zirvath was waiting for him, his massive form somehow fitting into a space that should have been too small. His burning eyes studied Samuel with an intensity that made the old janitor want to look away. But Samuel did not look away. He had faced death more than once. He was not going to be intimidated by a stare. "You saved my daughter," the emperor said. His voice was deep and resonant, filling the room like thunder rolling across distant mountains. "Yes," Samuel replied. There was no point in denying it. "You asked for nothing in return. You receive nothing in return. For 22 years, you have lived in obscurity, cleaning floors, never speaking of what you did." The Emperor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Why? Samuel thought about the question for a long moment. He had asked himself the same thing many times over the years. Why had he done it? Why had he given everything for a child he did not know? "She was just a kid," he said finally. "Scared and alone. It didn't matter what she was or where she came from. You don't leave a kid alone in the dark. You just don't." The Emperor was silent for a long time. In Draconian culture, such an answer was almost impossible to understand. Their society was built on hierarchies and obligations, on favors given and favors owed. Everything had a price. Everything was part of a larger calculation of power and influence. The idea that someone would sacrifice themselves for a stranger, expecting nothing in return, went against everything the Draconians believed. "Your people confuse me," the Emperor admitted at last. "You are weak compared to us. Your lives are short. Your bodies are fragile. You have no claws, no scales, no fire in your bellies. By every measure that matters, you should be nothing." He paused, his burning eyes fixed on Samuel's face. "And yet, here you stand. A simple man who did something that the mightiest warriors of my empire could not do. You saved my daughter's life. You held her through the darkest hours of her existence. You gave her hope when all hope was gone." Samuel shrugged uncomfortably. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," the Emperor said firmly. "You did what no one else would do. That is the difference. That is why my daughter has spent half her life searching for you. That is why she calls you her savior." He rose to his full height, towering over Samuel like a mountain of scales and fire. In Draconian culture, a life debt is sacred. When someone saves your life, you owe them everything. Your wealth, your honor, your very future belongs to them. My daughter owes you such a debt. By our laws, she should be your servant until the end of her days." Samuel's eyes went wide. "I don't want that. I don't want anything like that." "I know," the Emperor said. "And that is what makes you so dangerous." He turned away, looking out through a window at the city below. The other species of the galaxy have watched humanity for 2 centuries. They have seen your wars and your conflicts and your endless chaos. They have dismissed you as children playing at civilization, too unstable to be trusted with real power. He turned back to face Samuel. "But this story will change things. The tale of the janitor who saved a princess. The cargo handler who gave everything for a stranger's child. It will spread across 1,000 worlds, and everyone who hears it will ask themselves the same question." "What question?" Samuel asked. The Emperor's eyes burned brighter. "What else are humans capable of? What else might they do, if given the chance?" Samuel had no answer for that. He was just a janitor. He did not think about grand questions of galactic politics and the future of humanity. But as he left the Emperor's presence, he began to realize that maybe the answer did not matter. Maybe the question itself was enough. The story spread like fire through dry grass. Within weeks, every corner of the known galaxy had heard the tale of Samuel Torres and Princess Kael'thera. News networks that had once dismissed humanity as an upstart species now devoted endless hours of coverage to analyzing what the story meant. The reactions were as varied as the species that heard the tale. The Crystalline Collective, a civilization of beings made from living gemstone, sent a formal delegation to Earth. Their ambassador, a towering figure of blue crystal named Xylith, requested a meeting with Terran leadership. "We have observed your species for many decades," Xylith admitted, her voice chiming like wind through bells. "We saw your violence, your wars, your constant internal conflicts. We assumed you were too unstable, too dangerous. too unpredictable to be trusted. She paused, light refracting through her faceted body in complex patterns. But this story suggests we may have judged you too harshly. The capacity to sacrifice oneself for a stranger with no expectation of reward is not a sign of instability. It is a sign of something else. Something we do not fully understand, but something we wish to learn more about. Similar messages came from other species across the galaxy. The Harmonium, a collective consciousness that existed across a dozen worlds, expressed fascination with what they called humanity's individual heroism. The Void Singers, mysterious beings who lived in the spaces between stars, sent a single word in their ancient language that translated roughly to respect. Even the reclusive architects of the nested spheres, who had not communicated with any other species in centuries, sent a brief message, expressing interest in establishing contact with humanity. For the first time in its short history among the stars, humanity was being taken seriously, but Samuel Torres wanted none of it. The attention was suffocating him. He could not walk down a street without being recognized. He could not buy groceries or visit a doctor or do any of the simple things that had once made up his quiet life. Everywhere he went, people stared at him with wonder and gratitude, and something that looked almost like worship. It made him deeply uncomfortable. "I'm not what they think I am," he told Calthera one evening. They were sitting together in a small garden that the embassy had prepared for their meetings, surrounded by flowers and the gentle sound of running water. "They're treating me like some kind of hero, but I'm just a guy who got lucky." "Lucky?" Calthera tilted her head, a gesture she had picked up from humans during her time on Earth. "You call what you did luck?" "Sure. I survived when the others didn't." "That's luck." "I found you before you died." "That's luck." "The rescue fleet arrived before I ran out of air." "That's luck." Samuel shook his head. "I didn't do anything special. I just held on until help came." The princess was quiet for a long moment, her golden eyes studying his face. "You told me about the ocean," she said finally. "Do you remember? You described the waves, how they never stopped moving, even when everything else was still. You said that the ocean never gave up, never stopped trying to reach the shore." Samuel nodded slowly. He remembered that conversation. It had been on the third day, when the cold had gotten so bad that his teeth would not stop chattering. He had talked about the ocean to distract himself from the fear. "I didn't understand then," Calthera continued. "I was too young, too scared. But I understand now. You were not talking about water. You were talking about yourself." She reached out and took his hand, her claws gentle against his weathered skin. "You never stopped, Samuel. When your ship was damaged, you didn't stop. When your crewmates died, you didn't stop. When the cold came and the food ran out and the air grew thin, you didn't stop. You kept moving, kept fighting, kept holding on. For me," her voice trembled slightly, "that is not luck. That is something else. Something I do not have a word for in my language, but I know it when I see it." Samuel did not know what to say. He had never thought about it that way. He had just been doing what needed to be done, one moment at a time, one breath at a time. It had not felt special. It had just felt necessary. But looking into Calthera's eyes, he began to understand something important. It did not matter what he thought of himself. It did not matter whether he considered himself a hero or not. What mattered was what his actions meant to others. To Calthera, he was the man who had saved her life. To the galaxy, he was proof that humanity was capable of something more than violence and chaos. To the elder species watching from their ancient worlds, he was a mystery worth studying, a puzzle worth solving, and maybe that was okay. Maybe he did not have to understand it himself. Maybe he just had to accept it. "I never thanked you properly," Calthera said softly. In all these weeks, with all the gifts and visits and conversations, I never actually said the words. She stood and bowed her head, a gesture of respect that Samuel had never seen a Draconian make to anyone. Thank you, Samuel Torres. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for giving me hope when I had none. Thank you for teaching me about oceans and mountains and fields of golden wheat. Thank you for being the wave that never stopped moving. Samuel felt tears prick at his eyes. He blinked them away quickly, embarrassed by the emotion. You're welcome, he said simply. It was my pleasure. And somehow, despite everything, he meant it. In the weeks that followed, things began to change. Not just for Samuel, but for humanity as a whole. The elder species of the galaxy started treating humans differently. Trade agreements that had been stalled for decades suddenly moved forward. Diplomatic doors that had been closed for generations began to open. And through it all, the story of the janitor and the princess kept spreading, reaching further and further into the darkness between the stars, carrying with it a simple message that no one had expected. Humans were not just dangerous. They were not just chaotic. They were capable of something that even the oldest and wisest species in the galaxy struggled to understand. They were capable of love without condition, of sacrifice without reward, of hope without reason. And that, more than anything else, was what made them truly remarkable. 1 year had passed since the day Princess Calthera had run across the Grand Hall and embraced a janitor named Samuel Torres. 1 year of change, of growth, of a galaxy slowly shifting its understanding of what humanity could be. And now, on a bright spring morning, representatives from every major species in the known galaxy had gathered in New Geneva to witness something historic. The Treaty of New Geneva was the most comprehensive alliance agreement ever created. For the first time in galactic history, humanity would be recognized not as a junior partner, not as a probationary member, but as a full equal among the elder races. Every species that signed the treaty acknowledged that humans had earned their place at the table. The ceremony was held in the same grand hall where everything had begun. The marble floors gleamed under the light of 1,000 floating lanterns. Flags from 100 worlds hung from the crystal walls. Music filled the air, a strange and beautiful blend of melodies from across the galaxy. President Diane Holbrook stood at the center of the main dais, dressed in formal robes that shimmered with the colors of Earth. Beside her stood Emperor Zyveth, his golden scales catching the light like living fire. And between them, looking deeply uncomfortable in a simple civilian suit, stood Samuel Torres. He had tried to refuse this honor. He had told anyone who would listen that he did not belong on that stage, that he was not a diplomat or a leader or anyone important. But both President Holbrook and Emperor Zyveth had insisted. You are the reason we are here, the president had said. Without your story, this treaty would not exist. You have earned your place. So Samuel stood there, his hands clasped in front of him, trying not to fidget. The suit felt strange after so many years in coveralls. The lights were too bright. The crowd was too large. He missed his mock-up. Princess Calthera stood just behind him, her blue scales gleaming, her golden eyes filled with pride. She had helped him choose the suit, had spent hours teaching him how to stand and how to walk and how to look like he belonged among the most powerful beings in the galaxy. He still did not feel like he belonged, but he was doing his best to pretend. The ceremony began with speeches from the various ambassadors. Each one praised the treaty and spoke of their hopes for the future. Each one mentioned, in one way or another, the story of the janitor and the princess. Samuel listened with half an ear, his mind wandering back to memories of a damaged ship and a scared little girl. He thought about Captain Betty Hughes, who had turned her freighter toward danger without hesitation. He thought about his crewmates, who had died fighting to protect a vessel they had never seen before. They were the real heroes. He was just the one who had survived. When it was time for the treaty to be signed, President Holbrook stepped forward first. Her signature was small and neat, the practiced hand of someone who had signed 1,000 documents. Emperor Zirveth followed, his clawed hand leaving marks on the paper that looked more like art than writing. One by one, the other ambassadors added their signatures. The Crystalline Collective, the Harmonium, the Void Singers, species whose names Samuel could not pronounce and cultures he could not begin to understand. And then it was done. The treaty was signed. Humanity had officially taken its place among the stars. The crowd erupted in celebration. Music swelled. Cheers rose from 1,000 throats in 100 languages. Fireworks exploded in the sky outside, painting the clouds in brilliant colors. Through it all, Samuel stood quietly, watching. He still did not feel like he deserved to be there. But seeing the joy on the faces around him, seeing the hope in the eyes of humans and aliens alike, he began to understand that maybe it was not about what he deserved. Maybe it was about what was possible. Princess Kael'thera appeared at his side, moving through the crowd with the grace of royalty. "You look uncomfortable," she observed. "I am uncomfortable," Samuel admitted. "This isn't my world. All these important people, all these grand events. I'm just a guy who mops floors." The princess smiled, showing teeth that could have bitten through steel. "You are more than that," she said. "You are the wave that never stops moving. You are the hope that survives when all other hope is gone. You are my savior. And you are my family." Samuel looked at her, surprised by the last word. "Family?" Kael'thera nodded. "In Draconian culture, when you save someone's life, you become responsible for them forever. They are part of your family, bound by ties stronger than blood. That is what you are to me, Samuel Torres. You saved my life. You held me through the darkest hours. You told me stories about oceans and mountains and wheat fields swaying in the wind." She reached out and took his hand, her claws gentle against his weathered skin. "You are my family, my father, the parent I chose for myself, even if you did not know it." Samuel felt tears building in his eyes. He blinked them back, but more came. He was not ashamed of them. After 53 years of holding everything inside, after 2 decades of trying to forget, he finally let himself feel it all. "That goes both ways, you know," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was counting on it," Kael'thera replied. Around them, the celebration continued. Diplomats and generals and ambassadors mingled and talked and planned for the future. The galaxy had changed, and everyone knew it. But in that moment, none of it mattered to Samuel Torres. All that mattered was the Dragon Princess standing beside him, holding his hand, calling him father. He thought about Captain Betty Hughes and the crew of the Dusty Horizon. He hoped they would have been proud of what their sacrifice had led to. He hoped they would have understood that their deaths had not been in vain. And he thought about the future. Not the grand future of treaties and alliances and galactic politics, but the simple future of a man and his adopted daughter. There would be more conversations, more stories, more questions about oceans and mountains and all the strange things that humans did. There would be time to learn about each other, to understand each other, to become the family they had chosen to be. Samuel Torres smiled. The first genuine smile he had worn in many years. "So," he said, "what do we do now?" Kael'thera laughed, a sound like bells and thunder and something entirely new. "Whatever we want," she said. "We have all the time in the universe." And together, the janitor and the princess walked out of the grand hall, leaving behind the ceremonies and the crowds and the weight of galactic politics. They walked into a future that neither of them had expected, but both of them had earned. A future built on love without condition. Sacrifice without reward, hope without reason, a future that was truly, finally human.